Hi everyone, I'm super excited to show you this new palette by Natasha Denona, the I Need a Nude palette. You guys know that I am obsessed with Natasha Denona palettes, so I have lots of them and I am hence going to show you lots of comparisons. Angela Bright already did a lot of comparison videos for this palette, but I wanted to do this in natural light, so I'm going to be showing you all the comparisons by a very well lit window. We're going to compare this with the Retro Glam palette, the Retro palette, My Dream palette, and maybe the Pastel palette, probably not, and the Glam palette and the Love palette. So let's get started. Let's watch the first shade called Stone. I'm sure I'm gonna find something similar. Let's take this shade called Nurture from the My Dream palette. It looks a bit warmer. From the Retro palette, we're going to take this shade called Nude Mauve. And then from the Glam palette, let's grab this shade over here. The Stone shade is definitely very cool toned. It almost feels like there's a little bit of pink in it. Whereas the other shades are a little bit warmer. And the ones from the Glam palette, they just look very different. This one from the Love palette is totally off. Next shade is called Whisper. It's almost like the shimmer version of Stone, but it's lighter. It is absolutely stunning. So I'm taking the shade Glitz from the Retro palette, and it is similar, but Glitz is a lot more pink than Whisper. So let's try another shade. I don't see anything similar in any of the palettes, but let's try this shade from the Retro Glam palette, and yeah, that's definitely way more white. I am so surprised. I really thought I was going to be able to find duplicates of these two shades. Okay, next shade is Ella. Wow, that's a really beautiful shade. Let's take the shade Hello from the Retro palette. It's a lot more dense and maybe warmer. Another shade from the Retro palette called Jude. This one seems a little bit more cooler toned. But again, they are still not the same. Let's try this one from the My Dream palette. It's called Serenity. And again, these three shades look really different from the Ella shade. Moving on to the shade called Vague. Going to take the shade Rebellion from the Retro palette. It's not the same. It's a little bit more vibrant and darker. So I'm going to try Amara. This one seems closer, but yet still darker. So let's take the shade Go-Go. Oh yeah, this one is, again, too bright. And from the Love palette, yeah, none of these shades really match too much. I feel like they are brighter than the shade Vague. Now, I do want to compare the shade Ella to the shade Travertine to see if they're similar. I think they're different. They're not quite the same. I do want to grab a bunch of shades from the Glam palette and see how they compare to these bronzy shades. And it seems like the Glam palette shades are more golden instead of bronze. Here they are all side by side. So here's the first row. I feel like I couldn't really find that many matches. At least the shades in the first row are quite unique, which was really surprising for me. Let's swatch the shade Delilah. Interesting. I want to compare the Delilah shade with some of the other shades in the palette. And here they are side by side. I feel like Delilah and Ella are very close to each other. Up next, we have the shade called Silhouette, which is a very deep dark brown. So I'm going to take the shade from the Retro palette called Apart, but it seems a little bit warmer. So next, I'm going to take the shade Aspiration from the My Dream palette, which to me looks exactly the same. Next, I'm going to take the shade called Muse. It's absolutely beautiful. And let's compare it to a shade from the Retro palette called Psychedelic. Now, Psychedelic is a lot more pink, but I'm not sure why the camera makes them look so similar to each other. Next shade is called Fair. And I'm going to compare it with this shade from the Retro palette called Mod. Mod is a much lighter than Fair, but they do look pretty close to each other. Let's take the next shade. It's called Filigree. I'm sure I can find a similar one. Ooh, yes. This one from the My Dream palette is an exact match. Moving on to the next row, this shade is called Wit, and I'm going to compare it to a shade from the Retro Glam palette called Holly, which is a lot lighter. Another shade from the same palette called Belle is still different. And then from the Love palette, I mean, these shades are also very different. They seem lighter, brighter, just happier, which makes sense. Now here's a shade from the Retro palette called Go Go. And it looks like a darker version of this shade, but it's still different. Next shade is called Sheen. Oh my god, it is so sheen. It can almost work as an highlighter. It is absolutely beautiful. Yeah, and this shade from the Retro Glam is definitely different from the Sheen shade. So let's just move on to the next shade. It's called Tender. Oh, and it's very similar to the shade from the Glam palette called Crease. Here they are side by side. I mean, Tender is a little bit cooler. It has a little bit more pink in it, but they are quite close to each other. Okay, next one is called Mesh, which just seems like a lighter version of Tender. Nothing from the Retro Glam palette. I feel like these shades have more green in it. And let's try Vivian from the Retro palette. Oh yes, they look very close to each other. Okay, the last shade is called Mia. It is super soft and beautiful. And let's compare it to Glitz from the Retro palette. Ooh, they're very similar to each other. But I do like Mia better. So here I have taken all the shades where I was able to find some sort of duplicate and put them next to each other. And if I count them, I think there were about 8 shades out of the 15. So about half of the palette, you could find the shades elsewhere. And most of them were actually from the Retro palette. So if you already own the Retro palette and you are looking for a unique Natasha Denona palette, then definitely go for a Retro Glam or the Love palette. Personally, I do not like the pastel palette, so that's not something I would recommend. But I am personally really happy to add this to my collection, even though there are a bunch of repetitive shades, because the formula just feels so beautiful. Even if the colors might be similar, the texture of the shadows feel different. They might be a little bit more sheen at times, or they're a little bit more dense at times. I loved how the swatches felt, and I'm now super curious to see how these shadows will look on my eyes. I think it's a really good color story, a really good everyday color story, so this is a palette that I personally will be digging into a lot. I hope this video was helpful for you guys. If you liked the video, make sure you hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you. Bye.